And we think about this question a lot, the resurrection. The question is, did it really happen, right? So that's just a very simple question. We may ask these questions ourselves as Christians. Our friends who are non-Christians may ask this of us, right? So these questions has a lot of implications, and this is the thing that makes Christianity unique and is what Christianity is grounded on. So it's something to really be interesting to explore. Now, when we talk about this topic, and some of you might be familiar with the term apologetics, which really just means how we explain our faith in a reasonable manner. A lot of us think that it maybe is a very intellectual and cognitive topic, but it just doesn't just stop there. I think it's important for us, yes, to think of this cognitively, but really to let it strike at our hearts, our soul, and our spirit. So always keep this at the heart of the back of our minds, right? If Jesus really rose from the dead, what would this mean for our lives? And we have the privilege of Pastor David to, maybe share some details and depth on this later on, towards the end of today's session. Now, why is the resurrection so important? It's not because I say it's important. It's not because Christians today say it's important. It's the Apostle Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 14 says, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." Here we have the earliest Christian who was there when Jesus actually rose from the dead, saying this to a bunch of folks who would have also known if the resurrection was indeed a lie or was something that really seemed to happen and they cannot falsify, right? In fact, if you read earlier in this passage in chapter 15, Paul says Jesus appeared to more than 500 at the same time, some of whom are still alive. So can you imagine him speaking to this group of people? If the resurrection did not happen, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how did Christianity survive? And not just survive, how did Christianity even explode exponentially to what we have today as one of our major religions, right? So that's one of the key thrusts in how we approach the topic today. How did Christianity start, right? And I'll explain in more detail. I'll do a bit of introduction and introduce the methodology that I'll be using today. So just quick introduction, I'm taking today's session off a methodology from NT Wright. If you have been doing the study guide during Easter on Matthew, Tom Wright, the same person. So this is just the tip of the iceberg that I'm taking from the book that really gives you a gist of how he approaches this topic. So if you like the content today, it's not my credit. Thank NT Wright. And if you don't like it, then it's my fault, right? For poor delivery. And do grab his book if you are really keen. Now, with historical studies, it is different in a way where a lot of modern thinkers expect of truth. Today, a lot of us think of truth as something has to be 100% certain. We have to see it, we have to feel it, we have to touch it. Otherwise, we will not believe it, right? Even more extreme, right? Some of us think of truth like mathematics. 1 + 1 is always equals to 2, or we think of it as physics or any of the physical sciences where we can repeat something over and over again and always get the results, same results, right? NT Wright says that history remains, of course, unprovable in logical or mathematical terms. With history, it is not like that. Almost nothing is ever ruled out absolutely. That means that we cannot reach 100% certainty with historical investigation. That is the reality, right? But do we just raise our hands up and give up? No. What NT Wright says is what we are after is high probability. We can still get to a point of high probability, and we can attain these by examining all the possibilities, all the suggestions, and asking how well they explain the phenomena, in this case, the resurrection. So We cannot expect 100% certainty. It's not mathematics, but we can still reach a high level of probability. And that's what we're after today. If you think of a analogy today, it's almost like in the court of the law where we try to investigate a criminal, right? We don't go for 100% certainty. The event cannot be repeated exactly, but we go for what we call beyond reasonable doubt, right? Beyond reasonable doubt is not 100% watertight certainty, but it just means that we now have no reasonable reasons to doubt that this person committed the crime or not, right? So that's what we are after today. Okay, how are we going to apply this methodology to the resurrection? Now, we're going to focus a lot on how the Christian belief arose early. Now, Christianity today is alive and well. It's one of the major religions, right? And the question we ask ourselves is, how did we arrive at Christianity today? How did it get started? How did it grow exponentially? So this is already a fact. Whether it rose early, later on we'll explore in greater depth. But the fact is Christianity is alive and well. Assume for now it arose early. Now we have to ask ourselves, how did Christianity come into being? And who were the first Christians? They were first century Jews. So in order to understand the conditions that required to become a Christian, we have to understand the mindset of a first century Jew. Okay, that's how we're going to do it today. Two of the most prominent conditions that we see also in our Bible for explaining the rise of Christianity is the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances. So we're going to reverse our investigation. Just now I was trying to prove the phenomena, the conclusion. Now we already have the conclusion as a fact, but we're trying to understand what conditions explain this conclusion. Okay, so what we have to ask ourselves is the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances a sufficient condition? Could it have caused early Christian belief to arise? Now, after we answer that question, we have to ask ourselves, is it necessary? Because just being sufficient is not enough. Sufficient just means that, okay, that's possible, but it could well be other reasons. But if we can show that it's also necessary, then we have good reasons to believe that the resurrection actually happened, right? I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. So we're going to cover this main thread today. I've done the introduction and methodology. The first question we have to answer is, could the rise of early Christian belief arise by itself? Could it have just happened? Because if it could have just happened, the session ends, right? We can go home. So obviously it doesn't end here. If it couldn't rise by itself, we have to ask ourselves, what are the possible events that can explain the rise of early Christianity? And I will argue that together, the empty tomb and Jesus's appearance form a sufficient condition. Okay, if we put on the lens of a first century Jew, we would be able to be convinced that this would be sufficient for them to want to become and convert to Christianity. Now, then the second question that we have to go after is that, is it necessary? Because if it is not necessary, it could be other reasons, then it may not be the resurrection. It could be some other explanation. So Christianity becomes unverifiable at best, or at worst, it would have been false, right? But if I can show that it's both sufficient and necessary for the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances, then we can conclude that Jesus's bodily resurrection is by far the best explanation. Again, we have a Slido open. So if you would like, go on to slido.com, key in TROJ, the resurrection of Jesus acronym. And please park your questions inside and we will address them towards the end of the session. So the first question to address, could the rise of early Christian belief arise by itself? Firstly, let's ask ourselves, did Christian belief have to arise early, or could it have been a late development? Which means to say maybe Jesus roamed the earth for 30 odd years. Christianity did not happen until a few hundred years later, or sometimes maybe even thousands of years later. Now, who do we know are the first Christians? That's quite a well-known fact. The first disciples, Peter, John, Matthew, Paul, James, these are all first century Christians, right? So from there, it's already pretty obvious that Christian belief arose early. We also have writings from the early Christian fathers, early church fathers, that suggest that it's early. Now I'm going to go in a little bit into the mindset of a first century Jew just in a little bit. And once we understand that, I think it becomes even clearer and stronger that Christian belief had to arise early. It could not have been a late development. Okay, so just hold on to that thought. If Christian belief arose early, we have two options. Could it have been a natural man-made development? Could it have just happened by itself with some natural explanations? Or did something significant really happen for this to even be possible? And for us to investigate these two, let's again put on the lens of a first century Jew. Now, why do I keep repeating this? Because as modern 21st century thinkers, we like to apply our own perspectives to investigate whether the resurrection happened, right? So we might say, well, the resurrection could just be a vision. I could say the resurrection is just saying that Jesus is now spiritually alive somewhere. It's not verifiable. So that's very well how Christianity would have started, right? That's putting our modern lens onto a historical case. But if you want to investigate the case properly, NT Wright says that you have to put on the lens of the people and the witnesses back then who were first century Jews. They were the one that became Christians. So we have to understand how they think and what would have caused them to become a Christian, right? So let's try to understand what the first century Jews thought of the resurrection. And over here, I'm going to appeal to the Old Testament. Firstly, I'll look at Daniel chapter 12. If you look at verses 2 to 3, it says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Okay, I'm not going through the rest of the verses. But what this suggests is that those who sleep are people who have died, dead bodies, and these dead bodies in the dust of the earth, because they were buried, shall awake. Now, Daniel is actually a reference to Isaiah chapter 26. And if we look at verse 19, it says, your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise, right? Now we're talking about corpses, we are talking about physical bodies. What does this tell us about a first century Jew's understanding of resurrection? Number one, they believe that the resurrection happens. Number two, they believe that the resurrection is always a bodily resurrection. They are not thinking spiritual. If you read the Old Testament, all references to resurrection is always physical. Okay, so they believe in the resurrection. Their understanding of the resurrection is always physical. Now, if you understand the context of Daniel in this passage, it's actually a prophetic passage. It talks about end times, right? So what the Jews believe about the resurrection is that there will be a general resurrection at the end times where all believers would be resurrected bodily, okay? To make this even clearer, if you refer to Isaiah, verse 19 here in chapter 26, actually just a couple of verses earlier, if you refer to verse 14, it says the dead do not live. If you are dead, you are dead, okay? Those who are dead, stay dead. Shades do not rise because you have punished and destroyed them, blah, blah, blah. So after you die, you do not come back alive. That's the general circumstance. But in verse 19, it says your dead shall live because Isaiah was contrasting between normal times and end times, right? So it's the end times where the resurrection happens. So what do we get from this? The meaning of resurrection. Now, I didn't talk about the pagan understanding, but if you're interested, I can dwell more into that. Feel free to type it in Slido. But the meaning of resurrection, both in Jewish and non-Jewish world of late antiquity, it never meant that person had simply gone to heaven or had been exalted in some way, which was not bodily. Okay? There are other words, various rich variety of terminology that can describe other these embodied post-mortem states. Resurrection always meant embodiment. It was a physical resurrection. It was the same for the pagans who, of course, thought it was impossible as it was for the Jews. And that's interestingly why a lot of non-Christian historians even have to conclude that the tomb must have been empty, because historically, a first century Jew's understanding of resurrection is so clearly physical that if the tomb was not found empty, nobody would have believed in the resurrection, especially for a first century Jew, right? So putting on the lens of a first century Jew to investigate this, what does this tell us? The Jews believe that the resurrection is always bodily. So like I said, we cannot just say that, oh, the resurrection was just a vision. We're just saying that Jesus was spiritually resurrected. Yes, maybe that's how we could understand it today. But for a first century Jew, that was out of the question. The definition was clear, bodily. Secondly, they only expected it to happen during the end times. So what must have happened has to be unexpected. It had to be a bodily resurrection, and it had to happen at a time that they were not expected for them to even consider converting to Christianity, right? So think about that again. Always think about first century Jewish perspective. So I would argue that something significant happened. Now, the next question is, what are the possible events then to explain this rise of early Christianity? Now, I've shown that the rise of early Christianity could not have been a natural man-made development, because if you really put on the first century Jewish lens, how could it be? You already believe in a resurrection. It's not something that is special. A bodily resurrection is something you accept, but you expect it at the end times, right? So if none of those things happened, why would they become a Christian? If the body was still in the tomb, there were no appearances, they would have no reason to want to convert to Christianity, okay? So I would argue that something significant have had to happen. And the two most prominent conditions would be the empty tomb and Jesus's appearance. Or it could have been a set of other alternative theories, right? So now we're trying to think, what are possible sufficient conditions to explain the rise of early Christian belief? And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at a set of alternative theories that tries to explain one condition and ignore the other. So this is a common line of argument from skeptics. They would try to explain why the tomb was empty. The body could have been stolen. That was a common occurrence. Robbing tombs. Maybe they forgot where they buried Jesus, which is a little bit more far-fetched, or they forgot where they buried Jesus, right? But let's just take the stolen body, for example. That was an acceptable explanation. So by them approaching it this way, they can easily try to explain it away, right? By saying the tomb was found empty, fine, but the body was stolen. And they ignore the other. Or they would say Jesus appeared, it could be visions, it could be hallucinations, and they ignore the empty tomb. The question is, would this approach be appropriate? If I just take one of the conditions, would it be sufficient to explain the rise of early Christian belief? And I'll show why it would not be sufficient. Now, if we just take the empty tomb without the appearances, nobody in the pagan world would have interpreted an empty tomb as implying resurrection. Everyone knew such a thing was out of the question. Like I said, robbing tombs was normal. Somebody stole the tomb, the disciples stole the body, which was what was the excuse written in the New Testament. If that was the only condition, the empty tomb, again, as a first century Jew, would it be enough for you to believe that something significant had happened? I don't think so, right? You would just say, yeah, the body is stolen. The tomb is empty. So what? I'm going to continue to go on with my Jewish traditions. No Christianity for me, no thanks, right? What about if it was just the appearances without the empty tomb? Now, most people in the ancient world, they already knew that visions and appearances of recently dead people occurred. People do have visions of people who recently passed on, right? But such visions meant precisely that these people were dead, not alive. And that contrasts with Jesus's resurrection, where people believed that he was back alive. And even if several such appearances had occurred, as long as the tomb was occupied by a dead body, they would have no reason to think that the resurrection happened, right? So over here, what I've shown is that the empty tomb alone would not be sufficient, because it's easy to explain it away for a first century Jew. Neither is it sufficient to say that, well, we have Jesus's appearances, but the body is still in the tomb. Remember that the first century Jews believe in a bodily resurrection. So to have the body still present in a tomb is going to defeat the whole idea of resurrection for them altogether. So would they have become Christians if only one of this happened? They wouldn't. So the first set of counter arguments that the skeptics propose to try to explain one condition and ignore the other would not be a reasonable one, because just one of them would not be sufficient condition. What we need, so I've shown that the alternative theories, by just picking one of this, would not be able to explain the rise of early Christianity, right? One of them is easy to explain, and it's not sufficient for a first century Jew. So they must have occurred together for them to be sufficient. Together, that's how a first century Jew now have good reasons to think that, hey, something significant or weird or unexpected had really happened. Number one, this fits our understanding of what a resurrection is. It's a bodily resurrection. The body is no longer in the tomb. Number two, we expect the resurrection to happen at end times. But hey, this Jesus is appearing prematurely at a time where we were not expecting. Now, this would be, I argue, a sufficient condition to explain the rise of early Christianity. So even though individually they were insufficient, together they form a sufficient condition. So together, the empty tomb and appearances would be sufficient to explain the rise of early Christianity. Why? Because it meets their expectation of what resurrection means. The empty tomb shows that it was a bodily resurrection, and there was the unexpected element of a resurrection occurring before the end times, which challenges their first century Jewish thinking. And this gives them good reason to consider converting to Christianity. Now, we talked about the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances being sufficient, but just being sufficient is not good enough, right? Because like I said earlier, sufficient just means that, yes, it could explain it, but it could very well have been another explanation. What we need to be able to show here is that it's not just sufficient, but necessary, right? So is the combination of tomb plus appearances simply one thing that might have caused early Christian belief to arise, which just means that it's sufficient? Or is it the only thing that could possibly have done so, which would make it necessary? And if we can show that it's both sufficient and necessary, then hey, it sounds like the resurrection, right? Empty tomb and appearances. So I'm going to do a brief recap again. Rise of early Christian belief. Could it have been a natural man-made development? Given our first century Jewish understanding of resurrection, this is not very plausible or plausible. Something significant must have happened. The two prominent conditions were empty tomb and Jesus's appearances. The first line of arguments that tries to explain one and ignore the other doesn't work, because just one of these would not have been sufficient for a first century Jew to really believe that there was a resurrection that was different from what they were expecting, right? So why would they become a Christian? So the alternative theories that tries to explain one and ignore the other fails to explain the rise of early Christian belief. So while either of them alone were insufficient, together they form a sufficient condition. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we have to explore other alternative theories to see if there are other theories that could possibly explain the rise of early Christianity. Now, if we try to think of alternative theories and they all fail, then it seems to me that this is the only explanation that is possible, which means to say the condition of the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances would be the only explanation, and that makes it necessary. Why only? Because if we try to think of other theories, they all fail, right? So that would help us to conclude that it's not just sufficient, but necessary. So if I can show that they would fail to explain the events reasonably, we would be able to conclude that the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances was not just sufficient, but necessary. Now we'll explore two alternative theories here. And if you have other conspiracy theories, please feel free to put them into Slido, and happy to discuss them. The first one is what we call cognitive dissonance. It is a theory that the disciples were suffering from cognitive dissonance, the hypothetical state in which groups or individuals, they fail to come to terms with reality, right? But they instead live in a fantasy which corresponds to their own deep longings. In other words, the disciples wanted so badly to believe in Jesus that instead of facing the fact of his death, they claimed he was alive, right? An example of this is, let's say I bought a $300,000 car, right? I've paid $300,000 for it. No matter how horrible it is, I want to try my best to believe that it's the greatest car that I've, ever invested in. That is cognitive dissonance, right? It applies to shopping a lot. The question here is, from a first century Jew's perspective, is this a reasonable explanation? Now, what were the first century Jews expecting of Jesus in the first place? They were expecting a Messiah that would free them politically, a strong leader that maybe would free them from the Roman rule, make the nation of Israel powerful again, right? And what happened was completely out of their expectation. They saw their Messiah crucified horrifically, naked on the cross, died, and was buried. So from a first century Jew's perspective, would they, after have seen that horrific passion story of Jesus being crucified and dying, still want badly to believe in Jesus? Or would they have been completely distraught and disappointed and go back to their daily lives, right? The disciples went back fishing, remember? So I would argue that after seeing Jesus die horrifically on the cross and being buried and dead, there was not really a motivation for them to want to believe in a dead Messiah. So cognitive dissonance seems quite weak over here, right? Now, for the sake of argument, let me grant that, okay, Peter maybe had cognitive dissonance. Now, Peter, I consider the friend of skeptics. They love Peter. Why? Because Peter is the one with the guilty conscience, right? He denied Jesus 3 times. So he felt bad, and now he wanted to make up for it. So he had cognitive dissonance. Fine. For the sake of argument, let's just say Peter had cognitive dissonance. Now, would one disciple alone be able to convince the others and allow Christianity to expand the way it did to what it is today? I think that's pretty difficult. Again, if I grant, for the sake of argument, that, okay, I'll give you more disciples, right? Take more disciples, a few of them, many of them had cognitive dissonance, fine. Now you still have 2 disciples or apostles that you have to explain. One is Paul and the other is James, the brother of Jesus. Now these 2 apostles became Christians and they died for their faith. And they had no reason to believe or want to believe that Jesus was God. So how do we explain the conversion of these 2 individuals, right? So while Peter, the friend of skeptics, Paul and James always creates a problem for these alternative theories because they had no reasons to believe. In fact, they were skeptics themselves. Paul himself was persecuting Christians, right? So cognitive dissonance does seem to pale in comparison to the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances. Now, the second one that I'll explore is what we call a new experience of grace. This one is interesting. The first Christians, particularly Peter again, had a wonderful experience of grace and forgiveness, of seeing and enlightenment, which can be described as conversion. This was not originally anything to do either with an empty tomb or with any of the appearances in an objectivizing way. Basically, after Peter became a Christian, he started to have an inner sense of peace and joy. And this was what he tried to proliferate, and others start to feel the same way. And that was how Christianity started. Okay. Again, putting the lens on of a 1st century Jew, their expectation of a Messiah versus the dead Messiah that happened, would they have had the mindset or the mental condition to have this experience of grace? It does seem a bit odd, right? That's why Peter was called out here. Again, he's the one with the guilty conscience. Maybe he had that. Maybe he had that. Again, would Peter alone be able to proliferate the faith? Very challenging, right? And actually, this theory, if you understand it properly, assumes that they became Christians first before they had these experiences, right? And because they became Christians, this story of Jesus's resurrection started to spread. And even though it did not happen, people started to believe it was true, right? So that was the theory and how it happened. But again, you come to the problem with Paul and James, who would have no reason to want to have these, no reason to have this new experience of grace, right? And this theory suggests that this experience comes after they became Christians. So we have to first explain how they even in the first place became Christians before they can have this experience, right? So again, this is not a very strong alternative theory. And over here, maybe some of you might give pause and say, hey, Yuta, you picked like 2 of the most ridiculous alternative theories. And then of course you will win the argument, right? So firstly, I'm going to say that I did not pick these alternative theories, right? NT Wright picked these alternative theories. And I'm going to say why they appear so weak today is because once we've understood the methodology of understanding things from a first century Jewish lens, that is the reason why we can assess these as very weak theories, because now we have the correct methodology of assessing them. Imagine if you did not put on that first century Jewish lens and a modern lens, and you say, hey, it was cognitive dissonance. I think many people would be convinced, yeah, it could be cognitive dissonance. That sounds reasonable to me, right? But again, when you put on a first century Jewish lens, it seems highly, highly improbable. So what I'm suggesting here is, if we look at alternative explanations and they all fail, then the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances now become necessary, because it seems to be the only reasonable and probable explanation for the rise of early Christian belief. Right? So if I've managed to show that the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances are not just sufficient, but necessary, then I think we can conclude that Jesus's bodily resurrection is by far the best explanation. And I use this terminology just to be academically honest. We cannot hit 100% certainty, but I have to say that the evidence would be pointed pretty strongly, right? So again, just a quick recap. We have the rise of early Christian belief. How did that happen? Would it have been naturally man-made? After understanding the first century Jewish understanding of what resurrection means, it seems quite difficult. They would have no motivation to become Christians. Something significant must have happened, and the two most prominent conditions were the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances. Alternative theories that try to explain one and ignore the other would not work, because just one of this would not be sufficient. They would be an insufficient condition. So alternative theories that tries to take one and ignore the other fail to explain this and has to be rejected. So they must have occurred together for it to be sufficient. And if we explore further alternative theories to explain the rise of early Christianity, and that exploration tells us that they all fail, then it seems to me that the empty tomb and Jesus's appearances have to be necessary. And therefore, we can conclude that the resurrection did indeed happen. And that is the reason why a first century Jew would even consider converting to Christianity, because something strange really happened. A resurrection that happened at a time where they were not expecting, and a resurrection that was bodily, that fit their understanding of what it means for resurrection. All right, so this is what I summarized. So I'm just going to conclude by saying, like I said, historical studies does not help us reach 100% certainty. So it's not a walk in the park, but we can still get to a state where the gap is small enough for us to take that leap of faith to believe that it happens. I'm not going to pretend that faith is not required. In fact, we can go on and we can talk about how faith is required in many, many circumstances, right? Even in how we live in our daily lives. So what we're trying to achieve today is to show that our leap is perfectly reasonable, right? We can take this short leap. What resurrection is not, like many skeptics would suggest about Christianity, is jumping off a cliff. It's definitely not jumping off a cliff. The evidences are strong, and when we study historically, we have very good reasons to believe that the resurrection happened. So if Jesus really rose from the dead, what would this mean for our lives?